Hey, welcome today. We have, you guys might remember me from last time, last episode of The History Freak. I'm Jerry. I also do technical consulting for Jason. And today I get the pleasure of introducing the two people you're going to see today to talk about the American West. We have Jason and we have Ian. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy today's episode and take it away, Jason.
Very much, Jerry. Welcome everyone to another exciting episode of The History Freak on the American West and the Indian Wars. And we're going to get a little philosophical in this particular episode before we get into some collection. I want to talk about a quote from the poet D.H. Lawrence that was made about America, if you will, and Americans. He said, quote, "The essential American soul is hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. It has never yet melted." Now that's a pretty interesting quote. It is very controversial on the surface, but if you contrast that with some of the praiseworthy quotes from Alexis de Tocqueville at the very early outset of the 19th century, compare it 100 years later, it begs the question that we must ask. Is the frontier at all responsible for this hardening? So in short, did the American make the frontier, or did the frontier make the American? So I'd like to introduce our guest for today, Ian. Ian has a long family history in both the Civil War and the American West, has spent time on a ranch, and is our go-to expert on the American West. So I'd like to welcome Ian. Welcome to the History Freak.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm quite fortunate that my family took time to record their experiences, particularly in the Civil War. And although I didn't live the experience of the ranch life myself, my families were able to pass down many of those stories to me, and I was able to visit these places. So thank you very much for having me.
What do you think about that quote and the whole notion that the American either invented the frontier and the whole romantic notion of it, or the frontier made the American what he is and what he was? Because it was a harsh Spartan lifestyle, unforgiving, no holds barred, rough way of life. Any thoughts on that?
It's not a cop-out, but with any situation like this, I think there is a little bit of both. But if I had to lean to one side, I would say the frontier made the American, or at least a certain population of Americans. And as the country pursued manifest destiny, however complicated that notion may be, it did push us outward. And not only did it push us outward, it pushed others outward. It pushed some inhabitants that had been living in the United States for thousands of years before us. They were pushed into areas that they had never lived before. And however faulted that may be, that is the environment that the United States came up in. But it must have been remarkably isolated, remarkably stoic, and remarkably difficult. I understand people would work large plots of land that were difficult to work, particularly during the expansion westward, when resources, particularly in the plains, would be scarce. But they made do, as we saw, and maybe went too far, as we saw with the buffalo herds. And that expansion was supported in large part by the efforts to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. And that was a defining push in getting the United States out there, and part of that romanticism that we see today. The Wild West, if you look at it from the external opinion, I think a lot of international cultures lean toward that point of view of what America was. And I'm always interested to see what that history and what that foundation of what we Americans consider a cornerstone of our culture has contributed to what we are today.
Yeah. I really liked the way you talked about how kind of the frontier made the American. It was really, because with some of my family, we also have people that came from long ranch backgrounds. And yeah, there's something when you look at the American like frontier that's just a little bit different from some of the other frontiers.
It's interesting to note, I've done segments on the Civil War, and there will be future segments on the Civil War. A lot of the Union generals moved out west to staff the forts in the American Indian Wars. And, generals like Philip Sheridan, obviously George Armstrong Custer, against Native American Indian chiefs ranging from Sitting Bull to Red Cloud to Crazy Horse. It was a violent, brutal time. And I think, as the history freak, we seek to examine all sides as we merge history with collecting. So in that vein, Ian, I'd like to follow up. And I understand that your relative had some very interesting experiences and maybe some artifacts.
My ancestor, my grandfather, however many times removed, was a lieutenant in the 56th Ohio Regiment. And I was fortunate to get a copy of his journal here. This is not the original copy, but I'm remarkably fortunate that this is in print and can be ordered. His name was Thomas Jefferson Williams, and there has since been quite a long line of my family with that name. The reality on the ground that a standard infantryman experienced during the Civil War was absolutely horrendous. Marching for 18 hours a day, and when you see these things in films, it's not like you're marching on a clean, well-maintained road. It's muddy. Your boots are getting stuck in the mud because 300 men before you have traveled that same road. It's an absolute mess. You're sleeping in woolen blankets, drenched during rain overnight. And then the combat alone would be remarkably scarring. There's one account in this book, he describes his brother being killed next to him in battle. And although he's an excellent writer, the way he describes his brother being killed, he was in a charge. They were charging forward in a line, and his brother, who was next to him, took a ball to the chest and dropped dead. And with that, he continued on and continued fighting. And in another incident, he was in a charge with his musket at his torso, and a ball struck his musket. So he simply picked up another and continued on the fight. And I think the most notable battle that he participated in was Champions Hill, which was a substantial battle in the Civil War. He discusses, the trouble of gathering the men ahead of the war, of counting them by name and collecting their ages and collecting how they died. And right now I'm looking at the roster of this 56th Regiment, and the detail is pretty incredible. For example, I'll just pull a name out here, Jones Williams D, aged 18, date of entering the service, October 17th, 1861, period of service, 3 years, remarks, wounded May 16th, 1863, in the Battle of Champion Hills, mustered out with company on the April 25th, 1866. And this goes on for pages and pages. And he eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant because he was seen as a measured man and later entered small town politics. But I'm very fortunate to be able to look back and read what my ancestors have experienced and perhaps juxtapose that upon my own.
It's an incredible story, though. Actually, it really is. Yeah.
We appreciate that kind of personal connection to the past, in addition to the artifacts on the History Freak. Now, I understand you might have one other object, a belt.
That's correct. Yes, another one of my ancestors was one of the famed Pony Express riders. And as I think many of us Americans at least learned in grade school, the Pony Express has been romanticized as a key communication channel in the early American West, and it certainly was. And when you need information expedited across the country at a time when perhaps the transcontinental railroad was not in place, you do it on horseback, and you ride by night at a full sprint to set locations where you can perhaps pick up a new horse or rest yourself, hand off the message to another Pony Express rider. And I have his belt here. And you can see, and I've sent some pictures, perhaps that would be a better way to go, but you can see USNPS branded on the front there with some designs going all the way around.
Incredible.
It's in remarkably good condition. I'm quite fortunate my father gave it to me. It doesn't fit me. I find I've outgrown my ancestors. Maybe they'll be proud of that. But
at least they don't put big in front of your name.
Maybe not yet. There's a lot of history to come. But when I hold this, it is remarkably special, and I hold it dearly.
That sure is a great connection to the past. You know, I always say stay in the past. You know, we're living in the present, but we need to communicate back to the past to understand where we're going as a civilization in the future. So that wraps up the interview portion of this. I want to thank you, Ian, for being our special guest and sharing about your family and those artifacts and some of your thoughts.
Thanks, guys. I'm felt kind of like a third wheel there, but you know, I learned so much. That was some really cool stuff that you talked about, Ian. And you know, you don't usually include the IT guy, but I'm really happy you did tonight. So anyway, Jason has a lot of great stuff to show you going to complete his collection, and you know, hopefully everyone's going to enjoy it. And thanks again for letting me listen to this.
Thank you very much for having me.
At the History Freak, we always like to showcase miniatures. Here's a great collection of King and Countries from Sierra Toy Soldiers. Here we have the Little Bighorn series. First off, we have some U.S. 7th Cavalry, Custer's Regiment. An impressive pose of Miles Keogh, the Irish Civil War veteran and enlistee in Custer's Regiment. Just look at the attention to detail and the paint job on these figures. Quite impressive. I really like the paint job and the attention to detail on the Lakota Sioux Tribe warriors of Sitting Bull. It's no wonder collectors the world over like the attention to detail in these King and Country figures. An exciting new release is the Sioux Warrior, who's carried the American guidon taken from a fallen cavalry soldier. A great reference for the Native American medicine man and chief, Sitting Bull, is the 1891 book by W. Fletcher Johnson, author of the Johnstown Flood, The Life of Sitting Bull. The book is profusely illustrated. Here's a wonderful depiction of standing buffalo. And here's another of officers outside Fort Keogh. The book is well balanced, and I highly recommend reading it if you can get a copy. Moving on to Indian Wars period autographs, here is a faint but bold signature of John S. Poland, signed as Captain, 6th Infantry and Brevet Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. I have Bomsey autographs again to thank for this piece. And here is a signed card of Lewis A. Craig Sr., 32nd United States Volunteer Infantry. This is also from Bomsey Autographs. A wonderful piece. For starting your collection of either Plains Indians or U.S. artifacts, one great reference resource is Will Hutchison's Artifacts of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This is a great modern resource book. With great attention to detail, it dives into the historical backstory of each piece. Museum-quality photographs of the artifacts adorn each page. Well, now that you've seen an incredible interview, some artifacts, some miniatures, and some wonderful resource and reference books on the American West and Indian Wars, let's get to the real exciting meat that makes the History Freak above all the rest. Okay, here we have an 1872 M 5-button sack coat rescued from Fort Huachuca, originally used by the 9th Cavalry. This was rescued in the year 1946 by a Captain Charles Yell. He had a museum down in Tombstone, Arizona, and this particular coat right here was both in the museum and in 2 very important private collections. Someone sewed the cloth ones on it at some point, but it nevertheless is a very intact specimen of an important sack coat. Now, for you collectors out there who are on a budget, it's very important to remember that you can reuse the same half mannequin for all your different uniform projects. And a sack coat is a very important component because it can be reused for Union infantry during the Civil War, Indian Wars cavalry, and Indian Wars infantry. All right. Now let's focus in on the right arm, right side, and these chevrons. These are original Indian Wars chevrons signifying the rank of sergeant that I procured on the internet. The red color indicates artillery regiment, and the 3 bars represent a sergeant rank. The yellow hatchet's brassard represents cavalry pioneer or pathfinder. The yellow color designates cavalry. All right, now I'd like to point attention to the undershirt. This is a very high quality reproduction. Finding originals of this caliber are almost non-existent. Now we'll pan up to the kepi. This is an original Indian Wars kepi from my good friends at IMA, International Military Antiques. It represents the New York 23rd Regiment. Fantastic piece of history. And here we have an original Indian Wars pattern 1878 canteen with an original canvas cover and leather strap. You can repurpose these for both a diorama and mannequin collection for the Spanish-American War or the Indian Wars. It's quite a nice original piece and adds the right aesthetic. These are quite common to obtain, but in good condition with fine leather, they're getting harder and harder to find. This is an 1874 U.S. hanger belt and buckle. Very, very nice piece to complete the ensemble of the uniform. Attached to the belt is an 1870s original McKeever ammunition cartridge box. If you look closely, you could see the United States U.S. label on the pouch. It has a brass rod and closure pin that are still intact. These are quite plentiful as well, but they will cost you if you want good quality leather that has survived well over 130 years. I'd like to now point out the two haversacks that I have. One of these is marked with the famous logo of the Rock Island Arsenal. These haversacks are Indian War U.S. Army pattern 1878. These canvas haversacks with U.S. markings are a bold khaki color and made of duck canvas with D rings on their back, and they would attach or affix to the side or the back of the soldier. Here we have an original mess plate portion, circa 1874. This iron mess plate top dates to the original Indian Wars period. Accompanying it is an original fork used by soldiers at encampment. And moving over to the left side, we see a tinned steel mess cup, M1874, US marked, Plains coffee mug. Quite impressive. And don't forget an antique E.B. Manning coffee pot, which dates to patent date 1862 to 63. Made of pewter with a hinged top. It's a very fabulous piece to complete your encampment collection. Around the side of the soldier is a reproduction, a very fine reproduction, U.S. Indian Wars blanket that's blue with gray stripes. It completes the blanket roll ensemble and goes with the haversacks. And this is quite a treat here. We have a U.S. Army model 1873 to 1885 Springfield trapdoor rifle, bayonet, and sheath. The sheath is in quite rough condition, but you could still see the United States U.S. marker. And rounding out the accessories, we have an incredible period brush for linen and jackets, in addition to a cartridge and primer box and a primer case, all original to the period 1860s through 1880s. Next, I'd like to focus on the carbine boot scabbard. This is an Indian War pattern 1887 carbine boot for the Springfield trapdoor rifle. It's also marked by the Rock Island Arsenal, and it's from, again, my good friends at IMA, International Military Antiques. And now, to complete the weaponry of the collection, a Springfield trapdoor carbine. This is a model 1868 military 50 caliber centerfire rifle. 51,389 were produced between 1868 and 1872 respectively. This is dated to the Springfield Arsenal. The barrel is a full length, 32.5 inches long, as you can see, and it has matching serial numbers. It has the trapdoor style loading system on the breech, and the breech lock has an eagle head along with the date 1870 production and US stamping. It has a very attractive stock made of walnut wood, and there are even traces of the Inspector cartouches faintly visible under the lock plate. This is from Shiloh Relics, and it is quite a piece of history. Now I want to show you the action of this incredible rifle. Cock it back once is the safety. Twice, it's in firing position. The trap door is sprung and released like that. You would insert the cartridge in, close the trap door, and fire, discharging the weapon.
No.
And don't forget the U.S. Guidon, a 38 star flag and an incredible reproduction. This completes the whole ensemble. And here is an original Shako plate from a New York regiment. Quite impressive, along with some shrapnel and artillery pouch bags originally dating to the Indian Wars period. And as an added bonus, we have a McClellan saddle seat. The M1904 was the most common pattern of the McClellan horse saddle, and it was used by the U.S. Army from 1859 on into the 20th century. Well, that's all the time we have for today's History Freak. As I always say, stay in the past.